So tomorrow is actually the feast of Cardinal Newman. His feast day is October 9th. The reason why his feast day is October 9th is that that was the day that he was received into the church in 1845. So, and then you might just remember he was only canonized last year on the 13th. I guess they couldn't line it up perfectly, but they did it on October 13th last year. So maybe it would just, this is the prayer that actually Brother James composed. It was based on a prayer we used to pray for his canonization, but then we realized we had to make up a new prayer because the prayer works. So now he was already canonized. So in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. We pray to you, John Henry Newman, gentle Prince of the Church. May your teachings continue to inspire us. Your writings illuminate us. Your fidelity to the Catholic faith ennoble us. Trusting. Oh, you guys can't see that, right? Oh, wait, hold on one second. Hold on. Trusting in your love for the Immaculate Mother of God and your compassion for the perplexed, give guidance to the Christian people today. Through your intercession, may God's kindly light lead us safely to our heavenly home. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. I just thought it would be, I hope it's not too strained, but to make a connection between Cardinal Newman and the topic. You know, one of the reasons why Newman ultimately decided to leave the Anglican Church and enter the Catholic Church was over basically an issue of church and state. He was so disappointed, disgruntled over the fact that the crown had so much control over the church that ultimately led him to down the road of trying to see where the true church was to be found. And if you remember last week, I made a comment about how in many ways the separation of church and state in this country, in the United States, has really led to the flourishing of religion rather than what you might think, well, if the state supports the church will be stronger. And actually, that's actually not the case. Sometimes it's the exact opposite. So just wanted to pick up with, move along from last week, but I don't think I spent much time on this. This is, we talked about the Maryland colony, 1634. When people talk about freedom of religion in this country, it's usually two people's names that jump to mind. William Penn, of course, in the founding of Pennsylvania, and Roger Williams in the founding of Rhode Island. But Maryland and the Catholics, especially the Calverts, they deserve a lot more credit than they usually get. Now, this act concerning religion of 1649 was ironically at a time where the Catholics had been pushed out of power in Maryland and the Protestants were in power. So this was actually an act of Protestant tolerance towards Catholics rather than the reverse. And you can just see, I mean, it's written in, 17th century prose, but it's pretty readable in the 21st century. But, that no person or person whatsoever within the province professing to believe in Jesus Christ shall henceforth be any way troubled, nor in any way compelled to the belief or exercise of any religion against his or her consent. And that with the Calverts was really an important part of the development of freedom of religion in this country, which really goes back to Catholic origins. Just a little bit further after 1649, things changed very rapidly for Catholics in Maryland. 1689 was the Glorious Revolution. James II was overthrown. His Protestant sister and her husband, William and Mary, came over, and everything changed. It's interesting, if I was to do a little quiz now, what's the capital of Maryland? It's Annapolis, Ann City. It's named after William and Ann, his wife. The original capital of Maryland was St. Mary's City. Has anyone here been to St. Mary's City in Southern Maryland? Nobody's been to, it's an amazing place to visit. It's about 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half south of Washington, D.C. Once the Protestants kind of overthrew the Catholic hierarchy, the Catholic gentry of Maryland, they literally went to St. Mary's City and demolished it and turned it into farmland because they wanted to erase the original Catholic memory of Maryland. And it was not really excavated until the 20th century. And they came to find, this was amazing, they came to find in the last 20 years, if my memory serves me correctly, they found religious medals. They found religious medals that the Jesuits had brought over with them from Europe in the 17th century that actually went back to shortly after the time of St. Ignatius, that were in a field in southern Maryland that had been a farm for centuries, because literally they wanted to overturn the Catholic origins of the colony so they would not remember them. And then things got very tough for Catholics in Maryland in the 18th century. They were subjugated to the same sort of disabilities, if you will, that Catholics in England and Ireland were. Things like double taxation, they couldn't serve in the military, they weren't allowed to vote. Here's one. If they weren't allowed to own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. They even prohibited the building of any chapels whatsoever in Maryland. Actually, Queen Anne overturned that in 1705, and private Catholic worship was allowed. But then I think I mentioned that by 1715, the Calvert, the fourth Calvert, reverted to Protestantism. It was just too difficult to be Catholic. You were just discriminated against in so many ways. So the Calvert family went back to being Protestant. Now, here's something, make it a little more local to New York, a Catholic moment in colonial New York. Let me put a little question in the chat. We'll see if we'll do a little question. Who can tell me, here's a trivia question. You can type in who was the first Catholic priest to set foot in New York City? Since some of you are Catholic school educated, you might know, and no cheating, no Googling, no Googling, no cheating. I'll give you a hint. It was a Jesuit, and he was French. Any guesses? Any guesses who that was?
Lemoyne.
Lemoyne, that's good. That's a good. I know Ellen has roots in Syracuse, so that's a good guess. Isaac Jogues.
Isaac Jogues. I was going to think of Isaac. I was about to say, okay, Isaac Jogues.
Isaac Jogues. He actually set foot in New York in 1643. I won't go too much down the road of the North American martyrs, but here's a little levity. When he got here in 1643, the Catholic population of New York City was already half Irish. 50% of the population was already Irish in 1643. Now, the question you should ask me is how many Catholics were there in New York City in 1643? There were 2. There was an Irish woman and there was a Portuguese man, or it was the other way around, a Portuguese woman and an Irish man. Actually, the Dutch were very kind to Jogues. They let him go back to France. They were very open. They let him hear one of those 2 people's confessions, but then when he asked to celebrate Mass, the Dutch Calvinists would only go so far. They were tolerant, but they weren't tolerant enough to allow a Jesuit to say Mass in New York, in New Amsterdam. Now, let's go back to the PowerPoint. So the Dutch were obviously here since 1624. Then 1664, in come the English, out go the Dutch. The King of England now is Charles II, and his brother, James, is the Duke of York. And sometime in the 1670s, he became a Catholic. But when he came in 1664, not surprisingly, he changed the name of the colony to his title, and his ancestral dukedom in Scotland was Albany. So that's why what Albany used to be called Beaverbrook, Beaverwick, but he got to change the name, so then it became Albany. Now he was well disposed towards Catholics, and then of course he became a Catholic. In 1682, he named an Irishman from Kildare, Thomas Dongan, to come to New York as the governor. He was one of the Irish wild geese. Now that's an expression, at least one friend of mine on this call knows what the wild geese were. But the wild geese were in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. These were men who left Ireland, Irish Catholics, who went to the continent, to France, to Spain, maybe a couple of places, to fight in brigades for Catholic monarchs. They were part of the wild geese. Not sure how they got that term, the wild geese, but he was a wild geese, Thomas Dongan. Now, although the English had New York for about 19 years, in many ways the colony lagged behind New England, both in population and wealth, despite the fact it probably is the best natural harbor one of the best natural harbors on earth, New York, as we know. So very quickly, Dongan tried to remedy the situation. On orders from James, the Duke of York, he summoned the first assembly in the colony's history. Within 2 months, he summoned a legislative body, which was very forward-seeing, you might say. He gave charters to both New York City and Albany and tried to make peace with the Dutch. He was very accommodating and friendly to the Dutch. Some people would say he's one of the most effective English governors in all the colonies during the period of the English colonies. Now, he was a Catholic. He made no apology about that. But in 1683, and this would go along with the charter I just mentioned from Maryland, should go along as one of the foundational documents in American history in terms of the laying down of freedom of religion. So the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, which the General Assembly approved, gave freedom of worship to all Christians based on the fact that that's what the Assembly wanted to do. Now, Charles didn't like that. He didn't like the fact that they were saying that they were granting this freedom because the people wanted it. So he set aside that part, but he actually left the freedom of religion in place. He said, I can grant freedom of religion. You people can't, but I can grant it. And then, interestingly enough, after his death and his brother, James II becomes the king, he extended freedom of religion to all persons of whatever religion, which is amazing for the time. Now, obviously, this would have meant basically Jews. That would have been the only meaningful group that would have affected. And it was during this time that the French Huguenots arrived. They were welcomed by Dongan, French Protestants who had been they lost their freedom of religion back in France. Just a couple other things worth noting. It's during this time that the first Mass is celebrated, November 30th, 1683, on the site of what is now the Museum of the Native American, the old Customs House downtown, right near where the Bull is on Wall Street. That was Fort James. That used to be Fort Amsterdam. It was at this time that Dongan brought over with him 3 Jesuits to start a school. So actually, the first Catholic school and the first Jesuit school in New York City dates to 1685. The New York Latin School. I think the Jesuits tended to call all their schools the Latin School. It was just an easy name to go with. It lasted for about 3 or 4 years. Most of the kids who went to the school were Protestant. It was on the site of what is now Trinity Church on Wall Street. So if you know where Trinity is on Wall Street and Broadway, right there, that's where we think the school was. A local Protestant church used to ring its bell when the boys would know when to come to school in the morning. Now, it only lasted 3 years. It only lasted 3 years because then the Glorious Revolution came. And the Jesuits got out of New York by the skin of their teeth. And things got pretty rough afterwards. They were already a very small minority of the population, maybe 5% of votes. And then afterwards, there was a rebellion called Leicster's Rebellion. He was a kind of crazy German Protestant who had a kind of checkered career. A fair amount has been written about, and there was almost like a revolution here in New York, and he overtook the colony. Eventually, he was executed by the English. But in 1700, the Act Against Jesuits and Popish Priests was passed. And that law was on the books until 1783. And what that law said was no priest could come into the colony. And if one did, he would be arrested and expelled. If he came a second time, he would be executed. And then that pretty much led to a period of almost no real Catholic worship here in New York presence. There was a German Jesuit from Philadelphia who would come up here and there, who used a pseudonym, Father Farmer. His real name was Father Steinmeier, but he went by the name of Father Farmer, and he would celebrate Mass quietly in people's homes. We have the example of one person, an Irishman, who owned a stable. It's amazing how this stuff perdures, but he owned a stable, and he would go to church every Sunday at Trinity Church on Wall Street. So he would go to the Protestant church on Sunday, but once a year, he would go to Philadelphia, to Old St. Joseph's, what we now call Old St. Joseph's, which was founded in 1733, to make his Easter duty. He would go have his confession heard and receive communion. So he was able to go to church on Sunday, to a Protestant church, but once a year, he continued with his faith. Let me just stop there for a second. Any questions? Anything you'd like me to speak about a little more? If you want to unmute yourself, just go ahead. If you want to put it in the chat.
Anthony, in both Maryland and New York, when there was this counter-revolution against Catholics, what was the Protestant regime that was imposed? Was it Anglicanism, or did it include nonconformists?
Well, that's very good. The Maryland one, from the very early times, from the late 1630s, the Calverts reached out to the Puritans in Massachusetts and told them they could come and become settlers there, and would get the head right, get as much land. So Maryland was actually nonconformist. There was a back and forth between nonconformists, and then, of course, during the era of Cromwell, it was them. Eventually, it was the Anglican Church that took over. Here in New York, it was always the Anglican Church, except for this strange character named Jacob Leisler. And then, of course, I think I talked about this last week, but we had that strange thing that happened in 1741, where that one man was killed. They thought he was a Catholic priest, but he was really an Anglican priest. And there was the writer from the New Yorker, Jill Lepore. Does that name ring a bell? She wrote a book about 15 years ago called New York Burning. And it was about these riots in New York in 1741, which I think I mentioned last week, was really based on all sorts of crazy rumors. It's sort of the QAnon of the 1740s or something like that. So obviously people are always susceptible to conspiracy theories. They just travel faster now because of Twitter.
Interesting.
Anything else?
Yeah, Anthony,
Please,
what happened to the people, this is Eleanor, what happened to the people in Maryland, when the Catholics were clamped down on, like in that town, that city, Marysville or Mary?
So St. Mary City. So by the early 18th century, there was still a sizable number of Catholics. By the time of the Revolution, I might have mentioned this, there were about 25,000 Catholics in the 13 original colonies, out of about 2.5 million people. So about 1% of the population was Catholic. 16,000 were in Maryland, another 4,000 or 5,000 in Pennsylvania, and the rest were just scattered. They mostly continued to practice their religion, and they would go to Mass on Sunday in these private chapels that wealthy landowners had. The Jesuits also had a few plantations. Obviously, on some of these plantations, they had enslaved people. They would also have mass on Sunday that the local people could go to. Every once in a while, the colonial legislature would try to pass harsh anti-Catholic laws. And interestingly enough, the upper chamber of the Maryland legislature would always kind of slap it down and say no. They get it through the lower house, and then the upper house would slap it down. And the upper house had a lot of Anglican gentry in it, and they were much more moderate in their hatred of Catholics. It probably was more kind of a street anger towards Catholics, but the more educated you are, the less antipathy you had for it. Now, stop me if I said this last week, but what do you think the most popular book was in the colonies? Everyone should get this. What was the most published book, the most popular book in the colony?
The Bible, no?
Very good. Anyone know what the second most popular book was? Did I say this last week?
No.
All right, I'm going to put it.
Second.
Yeah, this is a trick question.
Was it a James Patterson mystery?
It's called
Pilgrim's Progress?
Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Oh, God.
Okay. So this was a book written in the 1560s by an English Protestant about the martyrs, the Protestants killed under Mary in the 1550s.
You told me this.
Yeah, so this book was, the Puritans came literally almost like with a Bible under one arm and Fox's Book of Martyrs under the other. So they had a paranoid fear of Catholics. And that was true down in the other colonies also. It's so important not to lose track of that. There were a couple of Catholic priests killed in colonial times. One thing I've always held on to, and I think it's still the case, ever since, and this is an amazing thing, and I think we as a nation should be proud of. I mean, not too many things we can be proud of, but at least since the time of the American Revolution, no Catholic priest has ever been killed in this country for being a priest. Now, priests have been killed in crimes and things like that, but there's never been that wild religious persecution that was true in Ireland. I mean, that was true in England of priests. So it shows you by the 18th century, a lot of that was tamping down in the colony. And that's what eventually leads us to, and let me go back to just a couple things about the revolution. Okay, the revolutionary generation. The end of French in North America, 1763, the French and Indian War. Okay, but then things heat up with the Quebec Act of 1774. Okay, which basically gave freedom of religion to all the Catholics in Canada, what we will eventually be called Canada, New France, Quebec. But the other part was all of the lands west of the colonies were also given over to the French, under French Catholics. And you can see what Alexander Hamilton had to say about that. Does it not make your blood run cold to think that an English parliament should pass an act for the establishment of arbitrary power and popery? So again, playing into what would have been the case there. But then very quickly, as the Continental Congress starts meeting, we mentioned last week, they sent a delegation, the two Carrolls, Franklin, to Montreal. All of a sudden, they start to change their tune, and now they're trying to invite Quebec to join us in the revolution. I think you'll get this one right. Who can tell me what Guy Fawkes Day is? Who can tell me what Guy Fawkes Day is? You can even tell me when it is.
That was the Popish plot in the 17th century, no?
So it's November 5th, 1605. It was the attempt by a group of people to blow up the Houses of Parliament when James had come in. And one of them, they were all Catholics. A Jesuit was implicated. He was executed also. But subsequent to that day, the November 5th, throughout England, you would burn the Pope in effigy on that day. It was sort of like a Halloween feast. Guy Fawkes was the name of the leader of the plot. That's where we get our use of the word guy from Guy Fawkes. Because little children would go around like trick-or-treating, and they go around knocking on people's door and say, penny for the guy,
Bye.
penny for the guy, because they wanted to put together a effigy, a scarecrow that they would burn. Sometimes they burned a pope, someone who looked like a pope, and sometimes they burned someone who looked like Guy Fawkes. And you could imagine it was like a late autumn festival. Now, in 1775, we're trying to get the French from Canada to join us. And the first commander of the Continental Army is a man by the name of George Washington. All of a sudden sees his troops on November 5th getting drunk and burning the Pope in effigy. So he sends out an orders in council saying, no more. Nobody can celebrate Guy Fawkes Day anymore. And that pretty much brings a complete end of it in the United States. It never celebrated here again in the United States. There is still a few places in England where they celebrated, and one place where they still burn the Pope in effigy on November 5th. Now, Catholics overwhelmingly.
Sorry, wait, one place? What place?
I'd have to look it up. There's one town. There's one town in England that still does it. Maybe they do it just so they can claim it then on Wikipedia. That's their thing they get to do. Keep their Wikipedia page alive. Catholics overwhelmingly supported the revolution. The one place that there was Catholics had a little more sympathy toward the Loyalists, I think I might have mentioned this, was of all places, Pennsylvania, because Catholics there were doing okay. You know, the rest of the country, Maryland, New York, when things are so bad for you and you feel discriminated against because of your religion, and there's an opportunity of a new change in government coming, you figure, might as well roll the dice, see what happens. Maybe things will get better. But things were pretty okay in Philadelphia, so they weren't involved in it. Now, just one last thing about our friend John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and who was involved in the writing of the New York State Constitution. He tried so hard in the writing of the state constitution to prohibit Catholics from voting or holding office.
Really?
And every time, now, and ironically, it was his ancestors who were welcomed here, his family, his grandparents or great-grandparents were welcomed here by Thomas Dongan in the 1680s. So he really did not like Catholics. He couldn't get it in the state constitution, but then he was able to sneak it in a law in the new legislature in 1788. They put a test act on the books that basically said you can't hold office if you won't take an oath saying that you owe no allegiance to any powers, including ecclesiastical powers. So it took about another 30 years before that was challenged in court, and the first Catholic was elected to state office. I want to say around 1812. And it was in 1784 that the anti-priest law, the law against Jesuits and other popist priests was repealed. Any questions on the revolution or anything on the revolution or how Catholics, this is really a beginning of improvement in the life of Catholics. And I think in one of my earlier slides, I call this the era of good feelings. Now, the American historians among us know that's really for the presidency of James Monroe, when this party system collapses and there aren't parties anymore, and it's kind of a misnomer, the era of good feelings. But from the period of about, say, 1783 to the 1830s, things get a lot better for Catholics in the United States in many ways. But then it starts to change. It starts to change because of immigration. Once the Irish and the Germans start coming here in large numbers, many of whom are Catholic, then Catholics start to be seen as a threat, especially because at least the Irish tended to settle in the cities. They were poor, they were unruly, and they didn't seem American. And interestingly enough now, some historians are realizing that a fair number of the Irish who came here in the early 19th century could not speak English. They still only spoke Irish. I think it's at least 20% were not native English speakers. So usually you would think of the Irish are being, they can assimilate more easily because of the language. But in the early 19th century, that wasn't the case. Let me just go back to the screen share. Okay, just a bit on Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Isn't that a great name, Charles Carroll of Carrollton? He's one of the famous Carrolls. He's a cousin, a very distant cousin of John Carroll. He's educated, the Jesuits had two schools in Maryland that neither existed for long. One was in Bohemia Manor, which is on the Eastern Shore. He was educated there. Then he went to Europe. He ultimately was extremely well educated at Jesuit schools, and then also in London. He came back, and this is interesting. He said, speaking of his Jesuit education, he wrote to his father that he regarded the Jesuits to be men of Republican principles who do not fail to inspire their students with a love of liberty. Honestly, that was something new to me. I did not realize that in the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, the middle of the Enlightenment, the Jesuits were teaching what we would call Enlightenment values. They had abandoned by that point this idea that in a perfect world, there would be a Catholic monarch who would ensure a Catholic religion. They had been moving towards what we would call liberal values, republicanism, freedom of the press, all that. In fact, one of his enemies, of Charles Carroll's enemies at the time of the Revolution, complained that he knew the problem with Carroll was he had been taught by Jesuits, he said, that were filled with evil ideas about religious liberty and civil rights for all. And this would eventually lead to the disestablishment of the Protestant church in America. Kind of fascinating about that. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He went to the first Constitutional Convention, but he technically couldn't represent Maryland because at that point, Catholics still couldn't hold office. But then they changed it, and he was the last founding father to die. Look at that. He lived to be what is that, 95? He lived to be 95. Pretty old age for the 19th century.
Wow.
Now, he did own slaves. He was opposed to slavery in principle. He supported gradual abolition, and he did manumit some of his slaves throughout his life. He also supported, which was a big thing at the time, the American Colonization Society, the idea of trying to repatriate Black people, formerly enslaved people, back to Africa. And that was obviously a 19th century thing.
Interesting.
Now, here's something, this is one of my favorite quotes. So we're just going to go back a little bit. During the time of the Constitutional Convention, during the time of the Continental Congress, all these great minds are meeting in Philadelphia. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and they're meeting, and then they need to relax. So on Sundays, a group of them would go around visiting church to church. And this is a letter John Adams wrote to Abigail, his wife, about his experience of going to a Catholic church on Sunday.
Oh, let's see that.
I'm going to read it aloud because it's just worth hearing it read aloud. This afternoon, led by curiosity and good company, I strolled away to Mother Church, or rather Grandmother Church. I mean the Romish Chapel. I heard a good, short moral essay upon the duty of parents to their children, etc. This afternoon's entertainment was to me most awful and affecting. The poor wretches fingering their beads, chanting Latin, not a word of which they understood. Their Pater Nosters and their Ave Marias, their holy water. They're crossing themselves perpetually. They're bowing to the name of Jesus, etc., etc. And you can just read it. It goes on and on. But I saved the last line. I'll let you just read it to yourself for a moment. But he saves the best line for the last. Here is everything which I can lay hold of the eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell. It's a really a great line of John Adams. And this is one of, the many letters that he wrote back to Abigail. Just very briefly, because we've talked about John Carroll, because John Carroll's a cousin of Charles Carroll. He's from a wealthy family, educated in Europe, becomes a Jesuit, comes back, eventually the first bishop of Baltimore. Then he's the Archbishop of Baltimore in 1808. And that's when the 4 new dioceses are created: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Bardstown. Rome backed up wrong horse there. They thought the big city in Kentucky was going to be Bardstown. It was actually Louisville, so the diocese was moved to Louisville. But this is a line that I like to quote often. John Carroll had some very strong thoughts about priests getting involved in politics. He didn't think it was a good idea. And he said that in the 1790s. And this is a line of his. I have observed that when ministers of religion leave the duties of their profession to take a busy part in political matters, they generally fall into contempt and sometimes even bring discredit to the cause in whose service they are engaged. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what John Carroll said 2 centuries ago. Now, probably the last major thing we'll talk about tonight. There's a couple of attorneys on this I can see. I won't put you on the spot. Does any attorneys know what this case is? You right? Okay. Attorneys know what this case is. So, this is very important case. Now, at least, hopefully, once I explain it, you'll take my word for it. You'll believe me. So I'm saying this is a period of relative comity between Catholics and Protestants. Something very significant happened in 1813. These are the players. You see them up top. Let me just speak a little bit about one of them. Anthony Coleman, S.J., an Alsatian Jesuit who was one of the few priests in New York City, and he was the pastor of the first church in New York, St. Peter's on Berkeley Street. Okay. Now this is how the story goes. In March of 1813, a man by the name of Phillips, Daniel and his wife Mary Phillips, were arrested because they were in possession of stolen property, jewelry that belonged to a Catholic merchant by the name of James Keating. I guess you might say in gangster parlance that Phillips and his wife were suspected of acting as a fence for stolen property. Now, before the trial began, Keating withdrew his accusation against the Phillipses because the stolen jewelry had been returned to him. The jewelry had been given to him by Anthony Coleman, by Father Coleman, the pastor of St. Peter's Church, at that point the only church in New York City. Now, understandably, the court wanted to know how Father Coleman had come into possession of this stolen jewelry. On 3 separate occasions, twice in court and once before a grand jury, Coleman refused to identify the identity of the person who had given him the stolen property because the person had done so in the course of making a sacramental confession to him. And if you can't tell, that's Anthony Coleman in that picture. Father Coleman told the court, if he were to break the seal of confession, quote, I shall become a traitor to my church, to my ministry, and to my God. Nevertheless, the district attorney, a man by the name of Gardner, decided to prosecute the case, and he ordered Father Coleman to stand trial. Eventually, what happened was he was going to drop the case, but then the trustees of St. Peter's Church wanted the issue to go forward. They wanted it to be what is called a collusive lawsuit. They wanted the lawsuit to go forward to prove a case. And that's what happened. The trial took place in June 1813 in City Hall, the City Hall that's just on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was only a year old at the time. It had been built in 1812. The district attorney Gardner explained that he was only prosecuting the case because he'd been requested to do so by the Catholic people of St. Peter's. He didn't want to do it, but he went. Since the Catholics wanted Father Coleman to be prosecuted, he was going to do his best to oblige. He gave Coleman the opportunity to speak first. And the way court, and this is amazing, I know the lawyers will hear on this, the mayor gets to hear the case. He's actually acting as in the judicial branch. This is all changed eventually, but this is how they did it in the early 19th century. Coleman stated the question clearly to the court. He said, the question now before the court is this: whether Roman Catholic priests can in any case be justified in revealing the secrets of confession. I say he cannot. Now, in rebuttal, the district attorney presented two arguments why Father Coleman should have identified the identity of the person who had returned the stolen jewelry. First, he said the state constitution nor common law recognized the privilege of confession. Second, he pointed out that in the state constitution of 1777, which we just mentioned, it outlawed preferential treatment for any religious group. He said, since only Catholics had confession, why should they get this privilege? Because Protestants could be obliged to reveal anything. A Protestant clergyman could be obliged to reveal anything made known to him by a layman. Now, Coleman's two defense attorneys were both Protestants. Richard Riker, the city recorder, and William Sampson, an Irish Anglican. So he was an Irishman, an Anglican from Ireland, who had left Ireland after the revolt of 1798, was very well respected in the Irish community. Someone described him as America's first civil rights lawyer, preceding Clarence Darrow by almost a century. Sampson pointed out to the court that even in 18th century Ireland, when things were extraordinarily difficult for Catholics under British rule, no Catholic priest was ever compelled to violate the secrecy of confession. And the other attorney also challenged the district attorney's arguments. The court considered a four-judge, including Mayor DeWitt Clinton. They voted unanimously to acquit Coleman a couple of days later. And these are the words of Mayor Clinton are worth repeating. He said, the witness in this case evidently believes that his answering in this case would expose him to punishment in a future state. And it must be conceded by all that it would expose him to privations right now in this world. If he tells the truth, he violates his ecclesiastical oath. But if he lies, he violates his judicial oath. Therefore, the judges decided the only course is for the court to declare that he need not testify at all. And this enshrined in American civil law what is known as the priest-penitent privilege, which is now extended to all ministers of all other religions, where just like the privilege that exists between an attorney and his or her client, where they can never be compelled to disclose it, that was true now under American civil law. By 1968, all but 6 states in the country had that on their books. Now, for some reason, let me just pull, I just need to pull up. And again, I can't really interpret this because I'm not an attorney, but in 1997, in a case unrelated to this, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia questioned the significance that American Catholics have traditionally accorded to this case, People versus Phillips. He thought it was a weak authority, he thought it was a weak case. So I don't know why he was just made, but it's somewhat ironic of all people to do that was Scalia. Now, I had my students, I did this with my students last week, and I paired it with something that is very topical, it's very real. In Australia is made up of maybe 20 states. I forget how many states there are in Australia. but at least a couple of them have now withdrawn the priest-penitent privilege on the case of clergy sex abuse. So what they've said there is if a priest hears in confession, the violation of a child, either from the child himself, herself, or from the perpetrator or a third party, he's obliged to go to the civil authorities. So we had, and that is and the one point I would make on that is because Catholics were so well regarded in the early 19th century in New York or in the United States, this incredible trust was given to them in terms of allowing priests this privilege. And then you look 2 centuries later, because of the horrific things priests have done and bishops have covered up, et cetera, now that's under attack. And it shows you how judicial opinions are very much affected by larger issues of what's going on around them. Obviously, we could argue that back and forth for a long time, but I think the point I would stick to is how the overall respect a religious community is accorded because of what they've done or what they haven't do will shape other parts of how that religion is seen. Any questions on that? Anything that you?
Your father, what role do you think the John Bowne and the Quakers and the agreement that they signed when the British came in, the Dutch sort of Peter Stuyvesant begrudgingly signed this thing and said, I've read that we really can trace a lot of our for all religions, that basically put in writing something that hadn't really existed before, and I'm just wondering whether that really was the undergirding of this.
I mean, Michael, that's obviously a very fair question. Up until the late 20th century, mid 20th century, most history in this country was written by Protestants. So, yep. in fact, I meant to say this earlier. Some of you may remember Arthur Schlesinger Jr., right? Remember the great advisor to John F. Kennedy? Well, his father was Arthur Schlesinger Sr., who was a professor at Harvard, a real WASP, Boston Brahmin. He said that anti-Catholicism was the oldest hatred of the American people. And he rooted that in because of the way the Puritans came here with that. And I would argue that the role that Catholics had, especially in Maryland and then here in New York, we were part of what the Quakers were doing in Pennsylvania, what Roger Williams had been doing in Rhode Island. So there were multiple streams, if you will, leading into this larger river. And it's important. It's only in the last part of the 20th century that the Catholic role in that was given recognition by scholars, if you will. But not to take away, like a lot of things, there's often multiple causes of something. And what you say about the Quakers is very much true.
What is the current state in America in terms of the priest-penitent privilege?
Well, it was the California state legislature last year introduced a law to disallow it. And I don't know if it didn't get out of committee or it didn't get out of the lower house. But up until this, I think you're going to see this returning again. And in Ireland, there has been some serious discussions of that also.
So what about, if the priest-penitent confidentiality is no longer considered absolute, why have attorney-client privilege?
Well, a very wise Australian Jesuit who I like to read said, he wrote in the London Tablet, he said, all this, and he's a very kind of, a progressive, open-minded man. He said, in Australia, at least in some parts of it, where if you're talking about the protection of children is absolute, then there are still 2 groups that are given absolute confidentiality, attorney-client and journalists. Journalists are not obliged to
Mhm.
turn over that information. So if you're really going to get rid of it, then get rid of it for everyone, not just the priest. So we'll see where that goes. And I know that's a very raw topic. And even in my conversation with a bunch of 17-year-olds, I could see how it's a very raw topic. It's a very sensitive topic. And I handle it with very gingerly. So the reason I bring it up is to show, I guess the larger point is, once we lost the respect of the wider culture, then something that had been around for almost for two centuries, now all of a sudden comes into question. Nobody was talking about this 20 years ago, and it's because of the criminal actions of a few.
Well, certainly lawyers don't stand too high in public opinion either.
No, well, as a former ink-stained wretch, I can tell you that reporters don't either. But I know that reporters have been sent to jail for upholding the principle, but they certainly were not immune.
Is that right? Now
Maybe
Australia's different.
unless there's a field law.
Okay.
Sorry.
No.
The
I'm
attorney-client
there are
privilege
certain-
is getting eroded as well.
Say again,
Yeah.
Don?
Certain
The
certain
attorney-client
states and
privilege
certain
is being chipped away at as well.
Is that right? Okay,
Yeah.
that's
See,
interesting.
there are certain states and there are certain government or municipalities that have field laws and others don't at all. And it's just like certain states, you have a right to work law, or no unions, and some, it's all over the place. But
Anthony, it was the
you
famous
can go
Regis
to
alumnus
jail.
Patrick Fitzgerald who led the assault on attorney-client privilege and a journalistic privilege in the Valerie Flame case.
Is that right? Oh, that's right.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
He
It's an example.
He put a couple of reporters in jail.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Anthony,
some have
this
gone-
is Kath.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, I mean, in terms of priests losing their, the privilege of secrecy in confession in the eyes of the law, I don't think it's entirely just a loss. I don't think it's entirely a result of Catholics having lost some respect in the eyes of society. It's the role that priests played and bishops played in being complicit.
Oh, no,
in
no, and that's why that's what 100% of what I'm saying. That's because of the violations that they perpetrated. That's why it led to that. And right, I mean, and I'm saying I understand it. I understand it, rightly so.
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's unwarranted. And then maybe just one last thing on that. The irony is, and this Australian Jesuit pointed out, it's not like there are hundreds of people going to confession every Saturday afternoon. Like you think like, oh my gosh, this is, I mean, it's kind of ironic I mean, theoretically, but it very little practical. So, he points that out also. I just, one last thing, because we're coming on 8 o'clock, but I just want to show you one last thing. Hold on. That is the infamous, famous Bishop John Hughes. It's actually a photograph by Matthew Brady. From the 1850s.
Photograph. Dagger John.
Dagger John, he's well known in so many ways, but one thing that he probably is, I mean, he's probably best known, he kind of came to people's consciousness in a backdoor way because of Martin Scorsese. So Martin Scorsese's movie Gangs of New York, which it's got to be 20 years old now, at least. In it is a scene where a bunch of Irish ruffians are kind of around a church with their rifles, as guarding the churches from Protestant mobs that were going to try to burn down the city. Martin Scorsese first learned about that as a sophomore at Cardinal Hayes High School in the Bronx in his church history textbook, when he learned about the Nativist Riots in New York City in the 1840s and 50s. And he based it off something that's probably not true, but it's like one of those things, if it's not true, it ought to be true. And it was, so in the late 1830s, there were Nativist riots all around the country and on the East Coast, including in Philadelphia, where a couple of churches were burned to the ground. The bishop there left the city, Bishop Kenrick, because he said that he was afraid that his presence was inciting the rioters. I think he was trying to protect his own behind. That's why he got out of the city. Now, when there were rumors that churches in New York were going to be burned, Hughes supposedly said to the mayor, he said, if one church in New York City is touched, I'm going to tell the Irish to make it another Moscow, which was a reference to Napoleon marching to Moscow and the Russians burned the city. He basically said, if one church is touched, I'm going to tell the Irish to burn the city. Not one church was touched. Now, that's why John Hughes is often remembered, if he's remembered in any way beyond just Catholic circles. But very briefly, Catholics in the public education in New York City. Early 19th century, we have the rise of the common school, Horace Mann. The idea that there should be a common school to provide a free education for all children of all background, to learn their ABCs and to learn a sort of broad, non-sectarian Protestant religion, reading from the King James Bible and sort of broad Protestant Christian values. In 1825, the city council, or whatever it was called back then, basically gave money every year to the Public School Society, which was a charity that ran schools. Sort of like the only way I can make the comparison, this would be, you know how the government today will still give money to orphanages? I mean, there aren't none left anymore, but like, social services organizations that are run by, like sometimes still run by Catholic sisters, Good Shepherd services, they'll give money to them. It's sort of, although there's a kind of a patina of religion, it's no big deal. That was true in the 1820s and 30s. But eventually the Catholics, under John Hughes, decided that they did not want their kids going to these vaguely Protestant schools. There are about 6,000 kids in the city. There are about 60,000 kids in school in New York City around 1840. 4,000, I think, were in Catholic schools. Only about 42,000 were in schools, so 18,000 kids were not in any schools. And these were kids, we're talking 8, 9, and 10 years old. This is a problem, to have that many kids not in school. Eventually, the Catholics began agitating that they wanted money for their schools. They said, look, we don't want to send our kids to your schools because we don't want them to get this vague Protestant religion. We want you to give us money for our schools that we're teaching them. They even said they would do things like have the nuns not teach religion until after 3 o'clock. They could just teach secular subjects till 3 o'clock. Well, you can imagine how this went over, and it went back and forth, and then it became a political football. And the two parties at this time were the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs were very Protestant, but they were being a little cagey on this. And the governor of New York at that time, William Seward, who would of course be remembered in the time of Lincoln as Secretary of State, he actually was quite friendly towards Catholics. So eventually what happened was this. After all this fighting, and the state nor the city would give any funding for Catholic schools, for religious schools, John Hughes ran a third-party ticket called the Carroll Hall ticket. And he basically ran it as spoilers against the Democrats. In the election of 1842, the Democrats swept the state in almost all elections for the assembly, except where John Hughes ran a spoiler ticket in New York City, and they all lost. 5 out of 6 of them lost to Whigs. So this was amazing to think that a bishop was directly intervening in politics. The very thing that John Carroll said they should not do, John Hughes did. He did it because his people, the Irish, were poor, they were discriminated against. He thought it was the way to go. be careful of what you wish for. Ironically, what happened was eventually the public school society was abolished. The public school system as we know it now was created, and no religious instruction of any kind was allowed in public schools. So what Hughes basically said was, after we lost the battle and he said, well, okay, we're not getting funding for Catholic schools, so take the Protestant Bible out of the public schools, and we're going to set up our own parallel Catholic school system, which he began doing in the 1840s. Eventually in the 1880s, here's a great line about that. He said, let me just see if I can find the line. He said something along the lines of, the day has come when we need to build the schoolhouse before we build the church. Because he's right in many ways. The future is with the young. And if you don't capture the people when they're young, it's much harder to kind of get them into the faith when they're older. So it was a very public fight. This fight between Hughes and the city and state authorities made it all the way to Europe. European newspapers were covering this fight, this interjection of Catholics into politics in the 1840s. So I'll give you a little taste for next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the rise of nativism. We're going to talk about another popular book, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. Don't ask me why. They always pronounce her name Maria Monk. I know it looks like Maria. The subtitle is On the Secrets of the Black Nunnery Revealed. We're going to talk about New York City as being the center of the Protestant crusade, and a little bit more about those nativist stuff that ultimately shape how Catholics relate to politics in the 19th century. I also will, I also would like to get into Catholics and the politics of slavery. Tomorrow, my students are you got to look for some positive things from the pandemic. So many years ago when I was at Georgetown, the man who directed my thesis by the name of Emmett Curran, who's about 83 years old and retired living in Kentucky, he's going to visit our class on Zoom. So he's going to visit with 17 students and me, and we're going to read it. The kids have read an article on the way Catholic attitudes towards the Emancipation Proclamation. Emmett wrote this article last year. You might be shocked to see what Catholic attitudes were towards the Emancipation Proclamation, especially Irish Americans and especially some leading Jesuits on how they received it. So we'll go through that tomorrow, and then when we meet again next week, I'll share. Obviously, I can share with you the whole scholarly article because I have a PDF of it. If you want to read it, you're most welcome to. But then we'll kind of go through it together in class and talk about slavery, the American Catholic Church, and the politics involved in that, which, as we know, is a pretty sad chapter. Thank you for joining me again tonight. Hopefully I didn't go as fast as last time, a little more conversation.